This podcast is produced by Benchmark Education.
On this episode, empowering multilingual learners through reading fluency. I'm Kevin Carlson, and this is Teachers Talk Shop.
Yes, teaching reading can and should be fun, not only for students, but for the teacher.
That is Dr. Lynne Kulich. Lynne works for Renaissance Learning. She is an author and researcher who presents nationally and internationally about early literacy. Lynne is the co-author with Dr. Timothy Brzezinski and the poet David L. Harrison of the book The Fluency Development Lesson, Closing the Reading Gap, which is published by Benchmark Education in its PD Essentials line. Benchmark Education's Dr. Jennifer Nye sat down with Lynne recently to discuss two topics near to Lynne's heart: multilingual learners and fluency.
Lynne, I am so pleased that you're here today to talk to us about all things multilingual learners and fluency. And I know we have had the opportunity to get to know each other prior to our chat today.
Yes.
You are a fellow Ohioan, so always excited to have you joining us and to share your expertise and really your passion for this. So take a few minutes and tell us your story.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, Jen, I should say OH, right?
I-O.
There we go. Yeah. So really, I have been in education now, oh my goodness. It's hard to believe, but it's true, over 30 years. Actually, graduated from Ohio State, and I was a French major, and had the best job in the world working with the Georgia Department of Education FLES program. And I helped write curriculum, promote their FLES program. But the best part was I also got to teach first and third grade French in Georgia. And that really was the impetus for discovering my real passion, which was elementary school. So from there, I got a master's degree in elementary education, decided to leave my French instruction piece a little bit by the wayside and just taught elementary school. And then, decided to get a PhD in early literacy and curriculum instruction, and taught at the university level for a little bit, but missed the schools. So I wanted to go back, but I went back in as a lit coach, and then I became a director of curriculum instruction. And in 2016, I made a huge jump. And I went to the ed tech world, and which now I'm at my current position as Senior Director Solutions Engineer for Renaissance Learning. So I still get to feed my passion. I still get to talk all day about early literacy, multilingual learners, all those things I love. So, but I think in this role I have the opportunity to reach a broader audience, which is great, because I want to impact learning for all students everywhere.
That's great. Well, I want to touch on your the beginning of your career as being a French teacher. So I suspect that being a French teacher came from a love of languages, which I'm sure then translates into all the subsequent roles you've had,
Yeah.
but also really supporting multilingual learners. So tell me a little bit about that personal interest with language and how that really supported your then later role of supporting multilingual learners.
I knew I wanted to be an educator, and I loved French in high school. So it was just this natural transition. I was going to teach French and spent time, of course, abroad, and really just love languages. And ironically, that background and my experiences teaching French in the elementary schools really helped me as I welcomed multilingual learners into my classroom. In fact, the school district, one of the school districts I taught in, I was kind of that magnet teacher, if you will, for multilingual learners who came into our building for first grade. So sometimes I had up to 5 multilingual learners in my classroom. And I didn't work in a district that had a particularly significantly large number of multilingual learners, but it just so happened while I was there that we did. So I just absolutely love working with them. You may have heard me say before, and it'll probably come out in conversation, I think they are superheroes and they have some incredible superpowers just waiting for educators to leverage. So I think that really began my journey. And so when I did my doctoral research, I knew I wanted to focus on early literacy, fluency in particular, and how it impacted multilingual learners. So I actually did my research with Korean Burmese refugee children who came to this country, landed in Akron, Ohio, and I worked with them for about a year and a half and saw great progress with some of the evidence-based practices, including, and I know we'll talk about today, the Fluency Development Lesson.
After the break, Lynne Kulich talks fluency. Stay with us.
Application and practice. These are the cornerstones of a new foundational literacy series from Benchmark Education, Decodable Fluency Builders. Your students will be immersed in a collection of carefully crafted fiction and nonfiction texts that combine phonics, high-frequency words, and language comprehension work. You'll see your young readers accelerate from mastery to transfer in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Two-sided teacher cards accompany each text to help you plan lessons. And you'll have on-demand professional development available 24/7 at Benchmark Academy. Guide your young readers towards comprehension with Decodable Fluency Builders. Learn more at benchmarkeducation.com.
So you're the co-author of a soon-to-be-released book about fluency. So let's talk a little bit more about fluency. What is it? Why is it important? And really, what got you so interested in that topic?
I always like to start by defining what fluency is. So it's so much more than rate, right? It's about reading accurately with automaticity and appropriate prosody, or, that's fancy word for intonation, expression. But I think there's a problem with that I know educators can solve. One, sometimes educators don't realize there are three components to fluency, but rarely do we ever teach students that. Perfect example, I was a literacy coach. One of my roles was to assess all 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students on oral reading fluency 3 times a year, right? Benchmark them. I will never forget, never. 7th grade boy who came out in the hallway because it was his turn to be assessed. He sat down beside me and he looked at me and he said, "How fast do I got to read?" It was one of those like hand to forehead moments.
That's so funny. I had the same thing with one of my first graders. She looked up at me. She goes, "Was I fast enough?"
Right, right.
Yeah.
And really, why do they ask that? Because that's how we've communicated the definition of fluency, right? But, really, research suggests, and this might be shocking for some people, 20 to 70% of any variance in reading comprehension scores, on like high stake tests, can really be explained by these bridging processes such as fluency. So fluency it's a pretty big deal. And I actually discovered the importance of fluency while I was completing my master's degree in elementary education. And that is actually when I stumbled upon the Fluency Development Lesson, which of course our book is about. And so what I did was I thought, this seems like a really excellent evidence-based strategy, right? Identified by national reading panels. So I started implementing it, not only in my first grade classroom, but second and third as well. And not only were my students engaged, but I had a blast. And, if we're being honest, if there's any time where we're having fun as the educator, then chances
So
are
true.
students are having fun.
So
And
true.
it closed all kinds of reading gaps. So
Yeah.
it was just amazing.
So you just mentioned as something cited in the National Reading Panel as an evidence-based practice, the Fluency Development Lesson. Tell me more about what that is. How is that actualized in a classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Fluency Development Lesson was developed by my colleague and co-author of the book, Tim Rzinski, and then his colleagues, Paddock, Linick, and Sturtevant. And essentially, they designed it for a single text, kind of a single activity, maybe 15, 20-minute activity. And what I did And what we have highlighted in our book is I've adapted it with Tim's blessing. And so what I did is I took a grade level text, preferably poetry, but you can use any text.
Mhm.
And I created activities that all are aligned to, for example, Scarborough's rope. So phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And I built those activities into this 15, 20-minute daily lesson where students were reading the same text every day, but doing all sorts of activities with evidence-based practices like choral reading, echo, partner, repeated, phrase reading, some readers theater, all of those great things, audio assisted reading. And that by reading the same text each day, engaging in different activities, performing the text for different audiences, even embedding a writing component, because we know that reading and writing are synergistic. There was nothing else I did when I was a classroom teacher that closed reading gaps like that. I mean, it was phenomenal.
That's incredible. Well, and something that strikes me, two things that you said. One is 15 to 20 minutes, right? Like, I think I'm confident one of the challenges that teachers continuously face, I faced it, I would suspect you faced it too, is how do I get it all in, right? Like, how do I add another thing to my day? And something that is 15 minutes is a lot more accessible to a teacher when they're adding something to their day. But the other thing that strikes me is, like you said, is the integration of all of these things. Learning to read and learning to write is not done in a silo of skills,
No.
right? It is
Or it
all
shouldn't be, right?
It shouldn't be, exactly.
Shouldn't be.
It's all woven together into this. I love the word you use, synergistic. Did I say that
Yeah,
right? Yes.
synergistic.
You know, into that type of process. So it's exciting to hear that something you found that is backed by evidence works in a way that is inclusive of all these practices, but also can be done in 15 minutes, which is
Absolutely.
huge. So good. Well, let's break that down a little bit more. So we've talked about fluency. We've talked about the fluency development lesson, which is a really successful routine that you use with your
Yeah.
students. But let's talk about fluency in multilingual learners.
Yeah.
What role does that help those students
Mhm.
as they're learning English?
Yeah. Well, not surprising, right? Fluency, which is really, if we break down Scarborough's rope, it's part of Scarborough's rope. And it plays a very important role in developing all readers, not just multilingual learners. In part because it acts as this bridge, right? It connects. So I'm going to nerd out here, right? If you think about Scarborough's rope and you think about, say, the simple view of reading, it connects the word recognition or decoding domain with the language comprehension domain. And so when students can decode fluently or effortlessly, then they can focus their attention to comprehending the text. And
They're freeing
so,
up that cognitive load there.
yeah, absolutely. And, there was a really great article that came out a couple years ago, Burns, Cartwright, and Duke. And they did some research on the effectiveness of these bridging processes like fluency, and that when teachers provided explicit instruction, for example, in fluency or interventions, they wanted to know how well it predict reading comprehension outcomes for students. And it had an effect size of 0.70, which is significant. So what we know is it works for all students, including multilingual learners. But if you think about multilingual learners in particular, right, we can teach them how to decode all day long, but they need lots and lots of practice so that they can become fluent and they can focus their attention on comprehending, right? So let's teach them how to decode and certainly what those words mean, but let's give them multiple opportunities to really practice becoming fluent readers. So it's a really big deal for them. And, in fact, one of the effective strategies with fluency is audio assisted practices or audio assisted reading. And one year I had a little boy from Vietnam in my classroom, And that year in particular, you know, of course I'm dating myself, but I would tape record with a cassette tape.
What's that?
I would tape record myself reading the story of the week from our first grade reading anthology. So I would send the cassette tape home with the recorder so we could listen to it, and he'd take his reading anthology home. And each night he would listen and, you know, hear me reading that story over and over again, and he could read along with the recording. And not only him, he had a younger sibling, and his parents were learning English as well. So it was that fluency practice that I wanted him to continue practicing at home in the evenings if he could. And I wanted him to have that fluent model. So I sent home that cassette tape.
Yeah. You also created that safe space for that practice too,
Yeah,
right? Like, I
yes.
think a lot of times, whether it's a multilingual learner or a striving reader, or really even a fluent reader, doesn't necessarily have that confidence when they're
Right.
practicing fluency out loud. So that's a nice way to give them that opportunity to get that practice, but also in a safe space. So I like
Yeah.
that.
It's that scaffolding they need, right? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Let's visit the beginning of our conversation. We talked a little bit about, you had a student, I had a student. I would suspect most educators that are listening to us probably had a similar one where the student said, did I read fast enough? Was that fast enough? And a lot of that, I think, stems also not only what we've taught our kids, but assessment too, because that's typically what we're doing to assess students. So you mentioned prosody as such a key component to fluency. How do you assess that in a classroom?
Yeah, it's a great question because unlike other constructs, you know, for example, rate, right, which we can calculate, we can get out our iPhones and time students and calculate their miscues. But with prosody, it's much more subjective. And actually, my colleague Tim Rosinski has a prosody rubric that, you know, you can certainly Google and use, where and it's a great rubric because it looks at multiple components of prosody, you know, their intonation, their phrasing, you know, whether or not they were monotone, are they cued into punctuation, right? The syntax, all of those things. And so it's a really nice succinct rubric that guides you through so that you can rate your students on how well their prosody is, because we know that prosody is a key component. And oftentimes it does go unassessed, right?
Mhm.
And so typically though, you can do it subjectively, and our ears hear that. We know when a student is monotone. We know when they're not phrasing a sentence correctly, right? Maybe they're not paying attention to the syntax in the sentence. They've skipped over the comma or the dash, etc. And when they do that, it can impede comprehension. So it is very important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another thing that I'm thinking about is the relationship between fluency and reading engagement or reading motivation. And let me tell you why I set this question up. So my daughter, who is now 20 years old in university and doing exceedingly well, but when she was in second grade, so she had already learned to decode, but she didn't have the stamina to get through the longer things that were at grade level in second grade. And her fluency was broken and it wasn't where it needed to be. And that experience, we fast forward, we found out something was going on with her eyes. So the longer
Yeah.
texting was breaking her fluency. But what it really also did, we were able to fix that. But what it really did was created a lot of frustration. It created a lot of disinterest in reading. She didn't want to do it. So, fluency has this great, from, what you're sharing with us today, it has this incredible relationship, this bridge between coding and comprehension. But I think that there's also something there for when you're a fluent reader, when you're able to cross that bridge, what that can do for your interest and your motivation to actually read and be a lifelong reader. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are all alike in so many regards, right? Because we're human beings. And if we struggle to do something, number one, we're less likely to continue to do it, right? And this happens all the time. Think about kids who try out certain sports or try out an instrument. Not really my thing, right?
Mhm.
My youngest son, who is a junior in college, I remember when he was first grade, tried out hockey and he did well, but after that, that was it, right? So, but but when we talk about things like reading, it's a civil right. It's
Mhm.
not an option. You can learn to read or not, right? Play hockey or play baseball, I don't care. It's a civil right, and every child has the right to learn to read, and we need to be able to provide the scaffolding to make sure, one, it's accessible to them and that it becomes joyful and it's a pleasurable experience. And there's multiple ways to do that, but providing the right scaffolding and providing explicit fluency instruction gives students the practice they need,
Love it.
because if you practice, you increase your stamina. And there was an interesting study out recently, I just read online, maybe a week or two ago, where since the pandemic, educators are reporting that students' reading stamina has decreased by over 80%,
Oh,
which is,
wow.
which is probably not
Yeah.
surprising. I think, we can tie a lot of things back to the pandemic. But that's a huge problem,
Yeah,
right?
80% is a big
Yeah,
number.
we've got to address that because students need to develop reading stamina. How do they do that? With lots of fluency practice and the opportunity to read things they love, right?
Mhm.
With the right supports there for them.
After the break, joy. Stay with us.
The journey towards language comprehension can be challenging, but one program can help students to reach new heights. This is Steps to Advance. Designed for children in grades 2 through 6, this powerful intervention resource helps build the vocabulary, comprehension, and content knowledge necessary to step up onto grade level reading. The program's highly scaffolded design features 10 topic units that integrate social studies, science, and English language arts. Available in both print and digital formats, the program seamlessly aligns with Benchmark Advance and may also be used as a standalone intervention. Learn more at benchmarkeducation.com.
One of the words I want to bring back that you just mentioned was joyful. So we talk a lot about, as we need to, the science and the evidence and the best practices and what is going to make kids read. But the fact that you can do it in a way that is joyful to create that engagement and that sustained interest in reading, I think is really powerful. And I think your fluency development lesson that is represented in your forthcoming book really tries to merge those two things together, the science and the art of teaching and making it an enjoyable experience while we meet grade level outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, fluency development, as you said, it's this juxtaposition of the science, right? Which science of reading is a big hot topic for very good reason, and art,
Yeah,
right? And the joy and the pleasure and the fun. Yes, teaching reading can and should be fun, not only for students but for the teacher.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so
Absolutely. Great. Um, Thinking still to your experience with multilingual
yeah.
learners, what are some other strategies or maybe like recommendations that you would give other educators that are supporting those students' English language development? What are some of the strategies and the things that you would recommend those teachers really tune into as it relates to fluency, but also just in general as
In
they're
general,
becoming fluent
yeah.
in English language and literacy?
Yeah, yeah. So I think I would be remiss, Jen, if I didn't talk about really who multilingual learners are. And I
Mm.
mentioned it earlier. I think they're superheroes.
Yes.
They have incredible superpowers. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, their native language is a superpower. It is
Mm.
not a hindrance, right? So they don't have deficiencies. Sometimes I think we look at them and think, oh, well, they can't speak English, right? But they have all sorts of assets, right? And
Mm.
that's our job to build on that. So I like to think of what I call these virtual backpacks, right? Like kids literally have backpacks and then they've got this figurative backpack. And it's teachers' jobs to unzip that backpack,
Mm.
figure out what culture, what language, what educational experiences these students have because they are not blank slates. They
Mm.
have all that. And so, how can we take that out of the backpack? How can we leverage it? And how can we encourage those students to leverage it, right? So, one year, I had two students from China in my classroom. So, you better believe we celebrated Chinese New Year. We read Chinese poems. We about China. We read stories. We did artwork, and the parents brought in traditional Chinese food for us to sample. Right. So not only were these students learning our English language and our American culture, but they had so much to share with us. So I just want to encourage educators to remember you know, they have so many assets
Mhm.
and just really so many superpowers. And if we leverage that, right, then we allow them the scaffolding to succeed. And one way you might be familiar, and I don't know if listeners out there are familiar with this term, but it's called cross-linguistic transfer. Okay.
Ah, yes. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And so in my mind, this is the ultimate superpower. So think of cross-linguistic transfer as like an umbrella. Okay. So if you're familiar with phonological awareness, it's like an umbrella. And
Yeah.
within phonological awareness, you have rhyming and you have phoneme segmentation and syllabication and all these components. Well, that's kind of what cross-linguistic transfer is like, but it really is about students leveraging their skills that they've already acquired, say
Mm.
maybe in their native language or the current language, to help them learn new language. So instead of saying to them, hey, forget about your Chinese, right?
Mhm.
We're not speaking Chinese in this class. Instead, you encourage them to use that as part of their scaffolding resources, right? Think about, for example, like even Spanish, we know there are a lot of cognates, similar syntax, similar social context. That should be what students are allowed to leverage. And that's really kind of what cross-linguistic transfer is. Take what you already know about your language and apply it as you're learning English.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so
important.
yeah,
And what you're describing, we may be talking about English language development today, but what you're really describing is valuing biliteracy. In your example, you may not be teaching that student whose first language is Chinese or Mandarin, but and you're not furthering necessarily in that particular classroom
right.
the reading and writing in that language, but you're valuing
Yes,
that language because that student is going to be bilingual, multilingual, whatever the case might
absolutely.
be. And that's a really nice that asset-based approach, like you said,
Yeah.
is critical.
And I think you're right. And, for teachers who are teaching and part of a dual language program,
Mhm.
this seems natural, right? Well, of course, now we're speaking Spanish and we're doing instruction in Spanish, and now it's English, right? But for emergent bilinguals who may only be getting instruction in school in English, right? We can't forget that they've got this whole other language that they can leverage.
Yeah, so important. So I think in some, as we close out this conversation, and tell me if you agree, I would say Fluency matters. Whether you speak English as your first language or you are an English learner, fluency matters. We have, as an example, the Fluency Development Lesson, lots of tools in our toolbox to help you teach fluency so it serves as that bridge to comprehension. But most importantly, it's remembering that students, all students, multilingual learners, emergent bilinguals, English speaking students, they all have assets that they're bringing to what we do in the classroom, and really leveraging those assets are going to be the secret sauce to helping make sure that these students are proficient readers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Great. Well, any last words of advice or any last closing remarks that you would like our listeners to hear?
Yeah, I think, we didn't talk much today about assessment, but I just think it's important as a wrap up to remind educators that, with so many state initiatives, especially around science of reading and assessments, screenings, diagnostic assessments, remember that unless you are assessing that emergent bilingual also in their native language, you don't have a complete picture of their reading skills. And so oftentimes when you administer a dyslexia screener, they might be the student flagged, right? But press pause. And we know we don't want to overassess students, but in cases like this, you need to triangulate data. And unless you have an assessment in Spanish, for example, if that's their native language, you need to make sure you have multiple data points before you say, yes, this child has some risk for potential dyslexia. We don't know that by administering a dyslexia screener in English, because we're not capturing all of their skills and abilities. And so, in essence, it's not their fault that we don't have a dyslexia screener in their native language, right? So we have to be very, very careful and continue to monitor students, but use multiple data sets before we make decisions, in that type of arena.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you mentioned the triangulation of data, right? Like those three pieces, do they consistently tell me the same thing? If they do, I'm going to have a much better understanding of what that child knows. But also I was talking with some dual language educators this past week and talking about assessment. And they said, imagine if you assess a child, and let's just say vocabulary, for example, and they know 10 words in Spanish and 10 words in English, but you only assess them in English. You're only going to get half of what they know. And what is that? That's a deficit model, right? It's not taking to your really good advice about the assets that they're actually bringing and looking at the whole child. So I think that's a great, your point is very well taken, and something that absolutely should be more part of the conversation and something we need to really consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, Lynne, thank you so much. It has been absolutely, as always, wonderful to chat with you. Your passion for multilingual learners, your passion for fluency, and your expertise is so evident, and I'm so appreciative of the work you do and your message, and fluency matters. So we'll keep having that conversation. And I thank you again so much for your willingness to share that with us today.
Yes, thank you, Jen, and thank you to Benchmark for allowing our dream to publish the book come to fruition. I think it's going to help a lot of teachers and students. So
I agree. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynne Kulich. Thank you, Jen Nye, and thank you for listening to Teachers Talk Shop. The book is the Fluency Development Lesson, Closing the Reading Gap, and Lynne's co-authors are Dr. Timothy Rosinski and the poet David L. Harrison. It explores the relationship between the science and art of instruction. A fluency development lesson is a direct, intentional, and science-backed instructional practice that helps scaffold students toward grade-level text, promote equity, and develop fluent readers who want to read. The book includes 140 lessons. Post-reading activities provide meaningful practice through word ladders, graphic organizers, cloze activities, writing prompts, and more. Move your students toward more fluent, proficient reading and joyful learning with the Fluency Development Lesson, Closing the Reading Gap. The book is available now at benchmarkeducation.com. Go to the Professional Learning drop-down and select PD Essentials to learn more and purchase this one-of-a-kind resource. Thanks for listening to Teachers Talk Shop. For Benchmark Education, I'm Kevin Carlson.